at this photograph.
Most would agree that the worst fate any artist can face is becoming nothing more than the butt of a joke. No matter if it's the fault of your actions or not, putting your blood, sweat, and tears into a passion project filled with honest artistic expression, only to be met with ridicule and laughter at your expense, can be a disheartening thing to experience. Some artists have grown to accept their status as punchlines, and some were even quick to embrace it, but it's not hard to understand how these people could feel insulted by them or their work becoming a laughingstock. One of the more recent and notable musical acts to receive this treatment is the band Trapt, who originally broke out in the early 2000s with a handful of hit singles, but are more infamous nowadays as a popular punching bag for music journalists and the rock music community for the behavior and beliefs of their lead singer. If you weren't there to witness the implosion of the Trapt empire, then it's impossible to understand just how shocking it was to watch unfold, if only in how quickly public opinion turned against them. It was almost impressive to see just how suddenly the goodwill towards Trapt had been squandered, and how willing the singer was to dig himself unnecessarily deep into further controversy. But one consequence of catching the ire of the public is that all your escapades beforehand get wiped from memory in favor of becoming a spectacle of widespread mockery. So I wanted to look into the full history of Trapt to see what they once were, how they became what they are today, and how drastically this shift in perception has affected them and their music. Despite me not being shy of making my opinions of Trapt known throughout this video, and even if some would say they don't deserve it, I do want to be as fair and objective as possible when documenting this band, instead of simply showing their lowest moments for easy laughs like many others covering the topic have. There's a surprising number of aspects to the story of Trapt that become more interesting once you have the full context of their whole career. And trust me when I say that even with the benefit of the doubt that will be given, the outcome of their story won't fare any better. So today, let's explore the very public downfall of Trapt, and how they went from a decently remembered band from a bygone era of music to a widely loathed symbol of how misplaced confidence and political provocateuring can easily lead to the downfall of a once stable career. In the mid-90s, Los Gatos high schooler Chris Taylor Brown and his childhood friend Peter Sherrill would form an impromptu rock band to play at school events, with Brown on vocals and guitar, Sherrill on bass, and another friend, David Steege, on drums. There was also another guitarist named Rick Sanders that might have been there in the beginning as well, but he never gets mentioned in biographies, and whenever he is brought up, no one can agree on how long he was in the band for. From what I can tell, I think he left the lineup in the middle of 2000 and became part of their touring band, but he doesn't really impact the story anyways, so we don't need to worry about him. Over the next summer, they would also recruit a new lead guitarist, Simon Ormandy, and after that lineup was secured and started writing original songs while practicing in Ormandy's guest house, the first official phase of Trapt would begin. The name Trapt didn't have any specific origins other than the general feeling of being boxed in by authority that Brown felt during his childhood, since he was self-admittedly a mischievous teenager and had often gotten in trouble with the law. Also, side note, but Wikipedia claims that the band was originally a punk rock cover band named Swingin' Utters before breaking up to become Trapt, but they don't have any sources for this, and they're the only reference to this fact I can find online, so it probably isn't true, but it's kind of funny, so I wanted to bring it up anyways. In late 1997, the band had cut together a CD of rough demos, which we unfortunately know little about, and would begin touring the Central California area. At one point specifically at the Cactus Club in downtown San Jose, which at the time was a hotbed for upcoming rock bands like Papa Roach, Alien Ant Farm, Smash Mouth, and even Nirvana right before their big commercial explosion. And when the band graduated from high school in 1998, they had even more time to dedicate to writing music and performing locally, and would even start selling their first official release at these shows, an EP titled Amalgamation, released in mid-1999. The band you'd hear on Amalgamation is very different from the Trapt you're probably used to. The band has given credit to several artists as inspirations throughout the years, like Pink Floyd, Metallica, or Genesis, and in their early years they were especially inspired by the upcoming wave of nu metal and rap rock, like Korn and Limp Bizkit, as well as other bands from around that time like Incubus or Tool. The combination of nu metal and prog rock on this record isn't completely seamless, and it's very easy to tell which musical ideas are inspired by which other band, with a not insignificant amount of blatant Kornisms being used throughout a lot of these songs. But despite these flaws, and despite my taste not really being on the Tool or Pink Floyd side of rock, there really isn't anything on this album I'd consider bad. There aren't any hidden gems on Amalgamation per se, but I can definitely see why people invested in the up-and-coming metal scenes at the time would be into songs like this, especially played live. And there's a lot of potential to turn this version of the band into hitmakers with more practice and a little industry backing. With their consistent touring and growing connection with local area audiences, Trapt was garnering impressive momentum and support for a band of their size. Although this consistency would only last until the members began their freshman years of college in the fall of '99, with Brown and Ormandy landing in Santa Barbara, Sherelle going to Santa Cruz, and Steege in San Luis Obispo. This increased distance and the wild differences in schedule were major roadblocks in how consistently they could create and perform music. And although the members were dedicated enough to make the trip to meet for gigs, it was clear that they wouldn't be able to balance college and music for long. So the members had to make the tough decision to either continue their academic careers or fully commit themselves to their growing platforms as musicians, with them all naturally choosing to focus on the band. After this, their priorities were now fully set on building up the band. They would double down on touring, they started posting their songs to online Battle of the Band sites, and they would even make another EP in early 2000, titled Glimpse. This EP shows a surprising amount of improvement in the band's music, considering how recent the previous release was. This record drops the rap metal influence almost entirely, and leans more into the dynamic style of melodic prog rock soundscapes and the angst and grungy guitars of nu metal, which are markedly better aspects of their inspirations to focus on polishing. In fact, this whole record is more polished in general, and the more blatant style jacking of artists they like is mostly absent as well, so the band comes into their own a lot better as a result. Overall, Glimpse fixed a lot of the glaring issues with Amalgamation, and in doing so is a much better EP and a good showcase for their evolution as musicians. Now with a few years of experience and 3 releases under their belt, their next goal was to pique the interest of a record label by any means necessary, and thankfully an opportunity was just around the corner, as after watching the group perform at the Troubadour in Los Angeles in late 2000, producer Jim Wirt introduced Trapt to Immortal Records, and the band were quickly in talks with them for a deal. For Brown, this partnership was especially exciting, since Immortal was the main label for both Korn and Incubus at the time. But despite the potential for this deal, Trapt's partnership with Immortal fell through only a few weeks later due to creative differences. The band tried to make a handful of songs with the label, but according to Brown, their A&R executive wasn't impressed because it didn't sound like Incubus enough. The band falling out with Immortal didn't kill their dream. In fact, it emboldened them to pursue it even more. The members all dropped out of their colleges and moved to Los Angeles to focus on the music, a decision Brown's parents weren't happy with, as they essentially cut contact with them afterwards. And Jim Wirt wasn't giving up on them either, as he had plenty of other connections with different labels. They were approached by Elektra Records shortly after for a development deal which Brown was interested in, but Wirt ultimately shot down for the sake of the band. After this, the band became even more serious, finally hiring a manager and recording a CD of demos to present to executives, which included an early version of a track titled Headstrong. Trapt would have run-ins with several more labels, including Atlantic Records and even a callback from Immortal, which they obviously didn't accept. This constant grind would turn out to be too much for David Steege, who left the band and moved back to Los Gatos in the summer of 2001, and was then replaced by drummer Robin Diaz. Eventually, the band's quest for a label would finally come to an end, when after performing at a September 11th benefits concert, they caught the attention of Warner Brothers Records, who subsequently signed a deal with the band after agreeing to give Trapt the creative control they desired. Now, with their years-long search for a record deal over at last, it was finally time for the band to be flown out to Vancouver to work on producing their debut album. According to Brown, the transition from indie releases to a major label production wasn't as jarring as the band had expected, though they fully understood the added expectations and pressures that comes with it, since there's obviously a lot more riding on the debut album being a return on investment than a homemade promotional EP with a comparatively humble budget. They also understood the added scrutiny their musical ideas would receive when in a real production studio, especially after working with the album's main producer, Garth Richardson, known for working with Rage Against the Machine and Mudvayne and infamous for having a meticulous production style. The creative process was not without its losses, however, as late into production, Robin Diaz would quit Trapt due to previous engagements with his other band, Closure, though he fortunately left after everything had been recorded, and they were on good enough terms for Robin to help them find a replacement drummer, Aaron Montgomery, who would stay as the band's drummer for close to a decade. Overall, the priority in terms of production was to translate the confident energy and raw emotions of the lyrics that audiences connected with in their live shows into a complete professional form. And after the work was finally over, the public got to see their first glimpse of the new Trapt, when the album's lead single, Headstrong, would release on September 22nd, 2002. Headstrong has a lot more baggage to it nowadays, given the public's disdain for Trapt in the modern day, but all that aside, just looking at the song itself and its relation to the state of the band at the time, I don't think it's that bad of a song. That's not to say it's without flaws. I think the fact that it was made to be very radio-friendly by borrowing aesthetics from the popular rock sound of the time has removed a lot of the interesting stylistic choices they took from their inspirations on their earlier EPs. And while I'm more apologetic to simplistic, arguably generic rock than most, I would understand why more hardcore fans deep in the nu metal scene would find the song sound somewhat hollow. And even Brown has admitted that his lyrics can be a bit on the nose and clumsy, especially early into their career, though he doesn't see this as a negative, as he's more focused on the style and musical ideas of the song and never enjoyed hiding the meaning of his lines behind unnecessary theatrics. But to play devil's advocate, if the intent was to instill the energy of a live rock performance into a fully produced song, then I think Headstrong definitely succeeds in what it's attempting to do. I can absolutely imagine a crowd of people anxiously waiting for the drop and banging their heads along to the chorus. Plus, although the writing isn't the best, nu metal songs having clunky lyrics has never stopped them from connecting with an audience before, and considering Trapt's later success, it clearly wasn't a massive hurdle. I don't think that Headstrong is an underappreciated cornerstone of the genre or anything, but I also think that the modern perception of the band has overstated the track's genuine flaws. At this point in their career, Headstrong is a competently made song, and an honestly perfect first impression for the general public to this newly unveiled band. Headstrong received decent success upon release, getting picked up by radio stations pretty quickly, but the band and the label soon realized that it would be a slow burn. So Trapt knew they needed to advertise the upcoming release as hard and strategically as they could, which would first come in the form of a recently popularized cultural innovation. As one of their first big pieces of promotion, Headstrong and the album were released early as a digital download on Warner Brothers and the band's websites, and by the time the album released, it had already sold 1,000 copies through this method. This may seem innocuous nowadays, but in late 2002, purchasing an album online and downloading it on your computer was a fairly recent and controversial innovation. This was only a few months after Napster filed for bankruptcy after getting sued by record companies, as well as a year out from when the release of iTunes and the iPod took a big kneecap to physical album sales. So Trapt was a relatively early adopter to this new method of musical consumption. In general, during this time, Trapt's image was inseparably tied to the internet. The band's manager found them through online promotion, Brown would frequently chat with fans and advertise their performances through email and on message boards. It's clear that a lot of Trapt's early appeal came from building a connection with their fans through early forms of social media. And all this extra attention would come to fruition just 2 months later, when Trapt's self-titled debut album would officially release on November 5th, 2002. When listening to this album, I was both surprised by how sharply the band's style changed from a less experimental, more radio-friendly sound, and also by how much I enjoyed most of what I heard. A lot of the sentiment from the time in reviews for the album was that they were initially turned off from listening to it because they thought it was just going to be an album full of headstrongs, but after caving in, they found it was better than they expected, even if not amazing. And me listening to it in the modern day comes with even more preconceptions, but despite that, I too was surprised at how well put together this album actually is. That's not to say that all the songs are great, but there wasn't any one track that I was appalled by, and the lowest the record ever goes is just being uninteresting. I was mostly disappointed by the fact that, again, even though there's a few occasional corner toolisms, that dynamic style on their earlier EPs is largely absent from this record, and the closest any of these songs get to that is some being in a 12/8 time signature, and I think that this polishing of their sound leads to an interesting dilemma for this record as a whole. With this album's sound attempting to be more mainstream, it has to play a balancing act with its angsty, more traditionally nu metal sounding sections with its softer, more melodic elements, as their goal to emulate the feeling of a live performance is a lot more effective from the former than the latter, and getting this wrong can hamper the effect of just listening to these songs by yourself outside of a concert environment. There are a handful of tracks that balance these aspects perfectly and are some of the best on the record, but for a lot of them you can definitely tell which of these intentions took priority. Also, it's ironic that they chose Warner Brothers over Immortal Records because they didn't want to be forced to sound like Incubus, because the comparison to Incubus is pretty apparent on this album, especially with the surprising amount of love ballads in the tracklist. Reviewers from the time also mentioned bands like 30 Seconds to Mars and similar adult alternative acts, but while a lot of those comparisons were meant as detractions, I do think that bands with the genuine emotion of nu metal in a less abrasive package are perfectly fine in the rock ecosystem. So overall, while this isn't the most impactful album from the time, and there are some flaws in the band's style that need buffing out, I think that Trapt's first album is a pretty serviceable and at times arguably high quality debut release. The self-titled album didn't receive a lot of feedback when it came out, which wasn't to say that the band wasn't seeing any attention, as Headstrong had climbed to number 29 on the active rock charts leading up to the record's release, but Trapt's eventual success would clearly be happening a lot more gradually than they had anticipated. So the band bulked up their touring schedule, kept promoting the album online, and continued to generate airplay, and over time this effort would start to pay off. By the end of 2002, Headstrong had only gone up to number 21, and it had taken that long for the record to debut on just the Heatseekers album charts. By April of 2003, the album had made it onto the Billboard 200, getting up to number 55, and Headstrong had finally made it onto the Hot 100 at number 71, and peaking at number 14 by November, although this was only a consequence of the band's real big accomplishment, when on April 23, 2003, Headstrong peaked at number 1 on the Billboard Active Rock charts. At that point, the band's exponential growth had finally started to hit its peak, and they received one achievement after another. They released the second single and best song on the album Still Frame in May, and that song had its own slow crawl up the charts, but by November it had also went to number 1, though only got to number 69 on the Hot 100. The album's third single, Echo, did decently well comparatively, only getting to number 13 on the active rock charts, but that was still another song in the top 20. And finally, on November 24th, 2003, the band gets their biggest accomplishment yet, when the self-titled album sells over 1 million copies and gets certified platinum. By this point in time, with the amount of airplay the band was getting for Headstrong alone, they were practically inescapable to any casual fan of rock radio, and after Headstrong won Rock Single of the Year at the Billboard Music Awards in December, beating acts like Audioslave and the White Stripes, it would be an understatement to say that the band's patience and dedication was paying off. Trapt had no issues with becoming as mainstream as they were, with Brown telling Billboard that he appreciates their music getting big enough that casual listeners unconnected to the rock scene would be interested in it, but understands that people listening to the more niche charts will stick with the band regardless of their level of popularity with the general public. But regardless of the band's feelings on it, Trapt was now firmly in the spotlight with a hit single and a platinum album to their name, which meant that there were a lot of expectations for them to continue that success on their subsequent release. The band quickly got to work formulating their next album, but that doesn't mean there weren't other projects they had their hands in. On March 30th, 2004, Trapt would release their first live album, an EP containing performances of a few tracks off their debut, as well as a previously unreleased song titled Promises. In early 2005, Brown and their manager founded Joint Venture Recordings, an indie record label meant to give up-and-coming acts the same chance at stardom they were given. And unlike a usual label, Joint Venture would make one-off deals to produce a single release for a band they saw potential in. This business model seemingly wasn't sustainable, as the label fizzled out after a few years, and very little information about the company or any artists they worked with remains on the internet. Although their first signed act, fellow California band Aphasia, did see press coverage and modest success with their release under the label 2005's Fact or Fiction. But of course, that was only a side business to the band's real focus, which was making their sophomore record. In April of 2005, they trekked to North Hollywood to work on the album with producer Don Gilmore, who previously produced for Lit, On a Place in the Sun, and Linkin Park for their hugely successful Hybrid Theory. The band's intent with this new record was to expand the philosophy of the first album into new, more interesting territory, both in its style and its themes. They wanted to have a more intense sound and to continue the themes of overbearing authority by tackling the overall idea of control, either of yourself or having it over others. The promotion for this album would also continue the band's internet-focused, fan connection-oriented approach, the most apparent of which being them selling the singles early as ringtones, which again was a tactic they were relatively ahead of their time for using. And that promotion would finally culminate when Trapt's highly anticipated sophomore album, Someone in Control, would officially release on September 15th, 2005. I'd describe this album as what you would expect a person at the time excited for a new album from Trapt would enjoy. Besides Don Gilmore's production, giving the songs some neat flourishes that work well with the band's usual style, there really isn't a lot separating the tracks on Someone in Control from the ones on their debut stylistically. That also means that a lot of the monotonously decent quality on the first record is also present here, but while there was still a good amount of experimentation to be had within the popular limitations of their self-titled, on here the band stuck to their formula a lot closer throughout most of the tracks, and in doing so made these songs all very same-sounding. There are exceptions to that, of course, but overall there really wasn't any major attempt to break away from what was expected of them to sound like, and their style not changing much might actually be worse than just disappointing, cause Trapt's been described as a cookie-cutter template version of the rock of the day many times after their debut, and some of the more common comparisons were Linkin Park, Incubus, and a lot of the other Californian post-grunge jacks, and no matter how good I think the songs are, there's no denying that Trapt's unoriginality is an ever-present issue. I mean, when the demo of Headstrong leaked on the internet in 2008, a bunch of people mislabeled it as a Linkin Park song. If that's not a sign, I don't know what is. So doubling down on that derivative style, and even getting the most successful of Linkin Park's producers to put a ton of Linkin Parkisms into the tracks makes their sound feel even more like jacking the styles of the bigger bands than if it were just their own original brand of overly conventional pop rock. In a vacuum, I'd consider this album to once again be pretty well put together, with nothing in it standing out as particularly bad. But in the context of their career thus far, the lack of any interesting innovations in their sound, as well as none of the songs really having the same broad mainstream appeal as the popular tracks off their debut, makes it so the outside intrigue for this record is ironically more narrow than the previous album. People who were already invested in following Trapt would be satisfied, but critics unimpressed by their first outing, or fans who wanted to see their new favorite band evolve past their commercial limitations, had a harder time accepting the fact that Trapt was taking a step back by not taking any steps in any direction. Someone in Control didn't have as big of an impact as the previous album, but it still did decently well for the band's standards. The album's lead single, Stand Up, released in July of 2005, made it to number 3 on the modern rock charts by November, which was much quicker than Headstrong took to reach number 1. Although it didn't catch mainstream attention like Headstrong did, so it didn't get close to the Hot 100. The record itself debuted on the album charts at number 14 in October, but began sinking down the list almost immediately, and left the top 100 albums by the end of the month. They would release their second single, Waiting, on January 17th, 2006, but this would only peak at number 21 and didn't give the album any more momentum. And the third single, Disconnected, released in May of 2006, only peaked at number 22 on the active charts and made similarly minimal impact. There isn't an exact number of albums sold for Someone in Control, but after all was said and done, the record would sell just under 300,000 copies by the end of 2006, and it would take 2 more years to eventually pass 500,000 copies and get certified gold. For major label standards, that's a pretty significant drop-off from their last record, and considering the singles also did a fraction of the numbers as the ones on their debut, it was safe to say that Warner Brothers considered Someone in Control a disappointment, and those feelings ended up being mutual, as Trapt felt like they were being mishandled by the label, and by the time they started work on their third record, they knew they wanted out of their deal. The band leaving was surprisingly unceremonious, with the band's management emailing the higher-ups that they were quitting the label and simply never receiving a reply back, implying that their contract had already gone unrenewed. So now, Trapt was once again shopping around demos in pursuit of a new record deal, and eventually they would catch the attention of 11-7 Records, a label run by bassist of Motley Crue Nikki Sixx, and whose music is ironically distributed by Warner Brothers. Brown said they gravitated towards 11-7 because they provided the band with even more creative control than Warner Brothers, whose higher-ups were pushing them to sound a certain way more often than they had anticipated. Their first release under this label would be a new live album released on September 18th, 2007, aptly titled Trapt Live, filled with performances from across both of their albums, as well as 2 original studio tracks, Stay Alive and Everything to Lose, the former of which was released as a single but didn't make it to any chart. In April of 2008, during the build-up to the release of the band's third album, it was announced that they would be headliners of Crue Fest, a music festival hosted by Motley Crue and fronted by several other 11-7 signed bands like Papa Roach and Buckcherry. This tour would begin on July 1st and ended on August 31st, and in the end would earn over $40 million. Being on a historic tour like that was one of the perks of being signed to a label like 11-7, though obviously not every new development from the band was positive during this time. In the beginning of 2008, after recording for their new album had wrapped, and just before Crewfest had begun, lead guitarist Simon Ormandy would leave the band on vaguely unwell terms. They would find a new guitarist to tour with them, a childhood friend of Montgomery's named Rob Torres, and after building chemistry with the group, he would naturally be promoted to the band's lead guitarist. Now after the dust had settled, besides the disconcerting terms of Ormandy's departure, all the turmoil had passed, or at least long enough for Trapt to rest easy so they could continue touring and eventually release their third studio album and first release under 11-7 Records, Only Through the Pain, on August 5th, 2008. Despite the angsty branding, Trapt goes in an interesting and contentious direction on Only Through the Pain, focusing surprisingly on the more radio-friendly pop-punk-esque relationship ballads that were a minority on previous releases, and often had less of their now trademark heavy, anger-filled sound. There are only a few tracks on here that sound like they could have been from their debut, or even on Someone in Control, and even when they try to emulate that style, it's clear that a lot of the edges have been sanded off in favor of their new melodic pop rock sound. There's no screaming choruses or themes of disrespecting authority, and the songs about breakups or bad relationships seem to portray smug detachment rather than righteousness or resentment. Some critics rejected the style on the album for not having any substance and desperately grasping for radio airplay while ditching the authentic emotion that made them interesting, and other critics praised the band for finally picking a lane and moving on from the off-putting meathead angst of their previous outings. In my opinion, on one hand, even if I prefer their earlier work, I can't blame them for wanting to change their style. I'd imagine it would be difficult to hold on to their teenage angst for their entire careers, but simplifying and cleaning up their sound like this does make it a lot more obvious when there's something wrong in how they're doing it. This is the first album so far where I really connected with the criticisms of the songs feeling generic and hollow, and this is also the first record where I couldn't look past the flaws of some of the lesser tracks to appreciate how well put together they are. On a technical level, there isn't anything wrong with any of these tracks, as returning producer Garth Richardson seems to work a lot better in this softer style than he did on their debut, and there are still some songs that stand out in quality, but the clumsy and often cliché writing is much more egregious when about a trope as overdone as romance, and I found myself getting bored of the album a lot quicker than their previous projects. There are a few moments of experimentation, like the opening track having an almost ska-like production, and a later song having a groovier faux reggae beat, but those quick, interesting points don't save the album from feeling repetitive and stylistically unimpressive. The change in style itself isn't really the main issue, although it is the cause for most of these problems. It's more that the band didn't do a lot to preserve their identity as Trapt while transitioning their sound, so there really isn't a definite artistic vision to latch onto besides it all being decent if bland pop rock love songs. So while I prefer their earlier classic rock influenced sound and am painfully aware that this album is rough around the edges, I can also admit that if the band learns from their mistakes and takes advantage of the opportunity given to them by this album, then they can take this new style into some interesting and consistently quality directions. Only Through the Pain had a similar response to Someone in Control, in that it didn't make that big of an impact and continued the band's declining status on the charts, and this was perhaps amplified by them now being on a smaller label and the album not having a big marketing push. The lead single, released in June of 2008, Who's Going Home With You Tonight, debuted on the active rock charts at number 34 and took an agonizing 4 months to peak at only number 11. When the album released in August of 2008, it debuted at its peak at number 18 on the album charts, before sinking like a stone, much like their previous record had due to a lack of staying power. The second single, Contagious, released in February of 2009 and peaked at number 18 5 months later, with both singles getting a comparatively low amount of cumulative airplay. The other two singles, Black Rose and Only One in Color, failed to chart altogether, and overall this album failed to captivate a wider audience like their previous albums had done. That's not to say the record gave the band zero accomplishments, as the lead single did receive an award during a music awards ceremony hosted by CSAC, who are an intermediary distributor and essentially union for recording artists that Trapt has been openly affiliated with. But besides this, there was little news coming out of Trapt, other than the announcement of a new album, of course. Through what little press this new release was getting, we knew that the record would be produced by Johnny K, who is known for working with people like Disturbed, Three Doors Down, and Finger 11, and that the band would be doubling down on their new melodic sound, along with the main theme of the record being the past shaping who you are and not being ashamed of the person you've become. Naturally, the album would be titled No Apologies and would officially release on October 12th, 2010. I'm finding it genuinely difficult to write anything about this album, because it has a lot of the same issues as the previous records, but it also left no real impression on me after listening. Never before has the phrase painfully average taken on such a literal meaning than to describe the emotions this album made me feel. They did end up going back to a harder sound with the return of electric guitars and thundering choruses, though it's still lacking the anger and energy that gravitated people towards them on those earlier albums, so the songs don't give off the impact the band wants them to. But besides those changes, this record really doesn't take the band in any interesting direction. There aren't any standout tracks in terms of quality, good or bad, and my go-to compliment that the album is at least competently constructed is starting to fall flat, cause now there's a pattern of these albums being unexcitingly competent and nothing else. There's no musical ideas on here that could hook someone outside of their core fanbase into sticking with them, cause there isn't anything distinctly Trapt enough to give listeners something to grab onto that other bands like them don't have. And the band left their trademark experimental sound and authentic writing style in favor of being stylistically repetitive and lacking convincingly written emotion years ago. So people giving the band a second chance after forgetting about them since Headstrong, or a last chance after being disappointed by their previous project, or had gotten on the bandwagon recently to see the exciting places Trapt would go next won't find anything on the album that would convince them to stay. And dare I say it, despite there being no single track on the record that offended my taste in any way, this consistently bland alt-rock homogeny doesn't give me enough of a takeaway to even be considered a good album. It simply exists as a mathematically perfect approximation of a 5 out of 10, and that lack of desire to grow past the bare minimum is the only annoying aspect preventing me from just calling this not the worst thing I've heard and moving on. It's really disappointing to see this band consistently pass up the opportunity to do something exciting with their music, and this downward spiral in quality really doesn't bode well with the rest of their history left to cover. Perhaps due to this lack of substance, as well as the project having very little marketing by their label, No Apologies continued Trapt's downward trajectory by becoming their worst performing album thus far. The first single, Sound Off, released in July of 2010, took 2 months to debut on the rock charts, and took another 3.5 months to peak at number 13. When the album released in October, it debuted on the album charts at number 25, and once again had zero upward momentum, only staying on the chart for just 3 weeks. They would attempt a second single, End of My Rope, in May of 2011 after Sound Off had died down, but this song didn't touch the charts at all, which was seemingly the last nail in the coffin for this album. After the album proved to be a disappointment, the band was very annoyed at 11-7 Records, both for not providing them with enough promotion and for trying to change their revenue split for digital sales from 50-50 to 20-80 in the label's favor, while saying that if the band didn't agree to these changes that they wouldn't promote their new songs as hard before going through with the changes anyway after they refused. That was naturally the final straw for the band, who left 11-7 in late 2011 and decided to not look for a new label and continue releasing music independently from now on, apart from getting their albums distributed by EMI. Their first new independent release would be a compilation of remixes and acoustic versions of tracks from previous albums in October of 2011, and by the end of the year and the beginning of 2012, they were teasing songs for their next official record. The album was originally slated for a November 2012 release, but due to reasons that have gone unconfirmed by the band, the record was delayed to January of 2013. People had speculated the delay was because of the state of the band at the time being unstable due to the recent shuffling of labels as well as a few more lineup changes. In early 2012, drummer Aaron Montgomery would leave the band and would be replaced by Dylan Thomas Howard, and guitarist Rob Torres would leave in the beginning of 2013, being replaced temporarily by Travis Miguel. But after all that had settled for now, the band could focus on releasing their first full-length independent album since Amalgamation, titled Reborn, on January 22nd, 2013. You have no idea how relieved I was when I realized this album was only uninteresting in a good way like Trapt's earlier projects and not in an annoying way like on No Apologies. I don't know if it was 11-7 bogging them down, or that they were just stumbling hard attempting to get back to their typical style on the last record, but on Reborn the band finally found a way to recapture that consistently decent quality they had on albums like Someone in Control or even The Debut in certain places. It definitely feels like they took the time they had with this record's delay to not make another cookie-cutter album and ensuring the tracks are as sonically impactful as the fans would expect. Some of the issues I had on the last few albums are still around, however, mainly that the style of the record is still distractingly formulaic. And on that note, while listening to this album, I came to an interesting and potentially cursed realization that Trapt is the angsty alt-rock equivalent to One Republic, and instead of Ryan Tedder's vaguely inspirational pop-rock anthems, you get Trapt's resentful anti-authority post-grunge. You know how if you know what to listen to, you can kinda tell which producer made any song? Like, even if they're not the one singing it, you'd know what a song written by Sia sounds like, or Jack Antonoff, or Ryan Tedder of One Republic, because there are certain identifiable flourishes that they really like using. Well, if you've listened to Trapt's music, which I doubt you have if you've made it this far into the video, you'll start to notice the couple ideas that the band really enjoys reusing. There's more general things like simplistic grungy guitar riffs and lyrics filled with on-the-nose metaphors, and there's more specific things like saying the name of the song twice in a row on the chorus.
Bring it, experience it all. Going under, too close, headstrong, we're headstrong.
And much like how the quality of most songs written by CO or Tedder is based on the track not relying on those reused ideas too much, the Trapt songs that are stand out in quality work because they provide more than just the handful of things people would expect the song to include. All of that isn't to say there's nothing new going on here, but the new things aren't as prominent as I think they should have been. This album generally uses a lot more digital production techniques like synthesizers and certain vocal effects, and while vocal delays and filters aren't an entirely new concept for the band, their reintroduction here is much appreciated. The synthesizers are also a neat addition, although they're mostly used as just intros building up to the usual guitar-focused sound without much intermingling, so there's a bit of wasted potential there. But overall, this album is a pretty good return to form, in that it's returned to not being the worst thing I've heard, especially from this band. Before we move on, I just want to note one track on this album in particular, Strength in Numbers, which is explicitly about the common man having the power to riot in the streets and overthrow those in control of society if they aren't giving them the things they deserve. In 2013, this was just more of Trapt being vaguely anti-authority, but if you know where the band's story goes from here, then you know the song's gonna take on an interesting new meaning a little later on. But regardless of the accidental foreshadowing, Reborn wasn't a very successful album on the charts, though that is somewhat expected with the band going independent and the musical movement they had been riding on being long past dead. The first single, Bring It, peaked at number 17 on the active rock charts in March of 2013, 4 months after its release, and the second single, Love-Hate Relationship, was only on the chart for about a month, peaking at number 27. When the album dropped in January, it debuted at number 44 before dropping off the charts 2 weeks later, which was the worst performance of an album of theirs thus far. The third single, Livin' in the Eye of the Storm, released in February of 2014 and didn't chart at all, but that doesn't mean that this month was uneventful for the band, as it saw the unexpected and aggressive return of guitarist Simon Ormandy. On February 24th, 2014, Ormandy filed a lawsuit against Brown and the band, claiming they concealed payment of over $300,000 worth of royalties to him after he had left the band in 2008. Not many details are known about the lawsuit, but it did seem to be a major financial and psychological blow to Brown. According to him, he was perfectly fine going through the proceedings to solve Ormandy's issues, but there was a looming fear that this lawsuit might destroy the band. Ormandy's parents were both computer engineers, and they had recently sold one of their companies to Microsoft, so he was using some of that newly acquired money to pour into this suit, meaning the band was outmatched in terms of resources. If he wanted to, Ormandy could have drained Brown of everything he and the band had through this lawsuit, and with that, as well as the arduous court proceedings weighing on him, it unfortunately meant that the production of new music was slowed significantly, though it wasn't completely halted. In June, the band announced its next upcoming album, DNA, and on the 17th, they created an Indiegogo campaign to help partially finance the album, as well as acting as a pseudo pre-order system, giving backers bonuses like limited edition merchandise, VIP access to Trapt shows, and even an opportunity to perform on the album. By the time the campaign would end on August 16th, it had raised $6,000 over its original goal of $50,000. The next big piece of news wouldn't come until September, when the band released an EP filled with acoustic renditions of tracks from previous albums, as well as having another lineup change, with Travis Miguel leaving his role as touring guitarist and Ty Fury stepping in as his official replacement, and as the recording guitarist for the upcoming album. 2015 would very much be a turning point for the band, as that year would see the first reported instances of them getting into controversy surrounding the behavior and social media use of its lead singer Chris Taylor Brown, who started to become more brazen about sharing his opinions publicly on the band's platform since they went independent, and whose infamy in that regard would slowly build from this point onward. For clarity, I won't go over every questionable social media post I could find, although looking through the archives I would have plenty of material. I'll be mainly focusing on the events that got attention from news outlets, as I'm trying to paint the picture of why Trapt fell from grace in the rock community and the general public. Also, with the nature of the topics we're about to discuss, I won't go very in-depth on debunking erroneous claims, unless I feel it's important enough to illustrate some sort of point. And finally, and this is less important, but just keep in mind that considering he graduated high school in 1998, Brown would be an over 40-year-old man while all of the following events would be occurring. On February 8th, 2015, the 57th annual Grammy Awards were held, with 2 winners of note being Paramore's Ain't It Fun for Best Rock Song and Beck's Morning Phase for Best Rock Album. These decisions seemingly frustrated Brown, who later in the day posted on Facebook claiming, perhaps hyperbolically, that the fact they won is proof of a conspiracy against the essence of rock music by the establishment, because they're afraid of riling audiences up by nominating something too threatening. It's not a controversial opinion to say that decisions made by the Grammys are confusing and often favor more mainstream-friendly artists, though with both Paramore and Beck being well-regarded groups, as well as the type of abrasive rock Trapt favors not being mainstream in close to a decade by this point, this post did garner some resentment regardless. On February 2nd, comedy music YouTuber Rob Scallon uploaded a video where he creates a heavy metal instrumental using only a single string on his guitar, effectively making a whole song using a single note in different timbres. In 2 weeks, it had already accrued close to 500,000 views, and plenty of people in the rock community were entertained by its ridiculous concept, including Chris Taylor Brown of Trapt, who chose to share the video to the band's Facebook page on the 16th, though instead of sharing the link to the video, it was downloaded off YouTube and uploaded to their page directly. The music community was angry at Trapt for what they called click theft, where because Trapt uploaded it to their page without crediting or directing people to Rob Scallon, they were essentially taking views and engagement that would have gone to Rob for themselves, knowingly or not. Scallon would respond to Trapt's post asking for it to be deleted and replaced with a direct link to his original upload, to which Brown allegedly deleted Rob's comment and ignored any other attempt at contact from him. The post would eventually be deleted off the band's page, with Brown later claiming that he was sent the video by his social media team with no knowledge of its origins, and that he edited the post to include links to Rob's page a few hours before deleting it. Adding the links later was a decently generous act of goodwill, and he even claims that he tried to compensate Scallon afterwards before he respectfully declined the offer. Although the band reposting it in the first place was the main issue, so him admitting he posted it with no forethought or knowledge of where it came from doesn't make Brown look any better. Succumbing to the public outcry didn't stop Brown from continuing to try to justify the repost, saying things like the post only got a measly 65,000 views and that Rob should be happy that Trapt was giving them more exposure. One person who criticized them on this was YouTube music commentator Glenn Fricker, who released a video passive-aggressively calling out Brown's bad excuses for his behavior and outlining how click theft can hurt artists. Glenn's insult-laden humor got a little heavy-handed at times, and him bringing up fair use was unnecessary because the issue had nothing to do with copyright, but overall he illustrated the community's frustrations with the band and content poaching in general quite well. Brown responded to Fricker's video by making a comment insinuating that Glenn showing the band's logo and using a 3-second clip of Headstrong in his video constituted as copyright infringement, which did not address people's criticisms of him and is just inaccurate legally speaking, as the logo was used in a journalistic context and the clip of Headstrong was used to criticize the band, both of which would fall under fair use. Brown also replies to Glenn at one point saying both that since Glenn's content wasn't ripped, he shouldn't have made the video, and that since the band's post was eventually deleted, there should be no more issue, despite them reposting it in the first place and the time it took to remove it were the two major criticisms. After this, nothing further would come from this feud, although Rob Scallon would continue to be a sore spot for Brown, and this situation would turn out to be the first in a long list of reasons why the band's reputation had begun to deteriorate. On June 18th, Brown posted to the band's Facebook page about how reality shows like Keeping Up with the Kardashians are ruining American entertainment by glorifying a style of flaunting their wealth by purchasing frivolous items and engaging in pointless drama for easy attention. It wasn't an incredibly notable post on its own, as hating the Kardashians wasn't exactly a bold or controversial opinion in 2015, but some of Brown's replies to commenters did draw some more negative press to the band. Replying to one person saying they respected Caitlyn Jenner despite not liking the Kardashians, Brown made a vague joke about Caitlyn Jenner being transgender. It could be seen as offensive, but not in a bigoted way. It just has such clunky phrasing that I'm offended he thought it was good enough to post. When someone brought up the Rob Scallon incident in the comments, Brown replied by calling the person Rob Scallon's butt boy, before continuing to reuse his underwhelming excuses for his actions farther down the thread. And on a less confrontational note, Brown would like a meme someone replied to the post with, which was a similarly clumsy joke about the lead singer of the band Suicide Silence dying after a motorcycle accident in 2012. More generally, Brown seemed to be quick to be argumentative towards anyone who disagreed with him on whatever he was talking about, and some users realized that it was relatively easy to push Brown's buttons by bringing up people in past situations he still held resentment towards. This aspect of his communication style would become a recurring theme throughout the story as well. In April of 2015, the lawsuit with Ormandy had reached a settlement, with the case being dismissed and Brown ordered to pay the missing royalties out of pocket. It was fortunate for them that this dispute got resolved rather quickly, although this would only be a brief reprieve from Brown's continuing spiral into controversy. On July 26, 2015, Brown would perform at the Stanhope House in Stanhope, Stanhope, New Jersey, while on tour with Sons of Texas, and they had brought along local New Jersey band Too Far Lost as an opening act. After the performances, Brown and Ty Fury got into a verbal altercation with the members of Too Far Lost over how the band was handling merchandise for the event, and a short clip of this argument would be leaked onto YouTube.
Are you gonna file a restraining order on us too?
I'm gonna consider this aggressive.
Oh wow, like a little fucking pussy.
Yeah.
On the 27th, Brown would post a video to the band's Facebook in order to address some of the recent controversies and explain how the stress and turmoil from the Ormandy lawsuit led to his emotions boiling over and him acting erratically. Andy Bain, frontman of the band Danger Kids and friend of Too Far Lost, felt the video to be disingenuous, as he attempts to take accountability but never addresses the incident at Stanhope. Bain responded to the video with a link to the leaked YouTube clip and claimed that Brown didn't allow Too Far Lost to sell merch at the event, called them fat and worthless, and said that they didn't matter to him since they were only a local band. Brown would respond by telling Bain to worry about his own band and belittling Danger Kids' level of success by bragging about how many songs Trapt got in the top 20 of the rock charts. Brown also tried to clarify how the situation actually started, as according to him, Too Far Lost was using 3 tables to display their merch, being run by the bass player's girlfriend, and Trapt had asked to let Sons of Texas use one of their tables to sell their own merch, to which she got angry and started saying no one would be at the show if their band wasn't there to promote it, despite Brown claiming that they had sold only 20 tickets during the show. Bain replied by making fun of Trapt for clinging on to Headstrong so closely, to which Brown responded by calling them jealous, and after that the thread became a back and forth insult match.
A friend of ours, like a band friend of ours, like we meet up with them every time we're playing like Jersey or whatever. His band played with them, opened up for them, sold tickets, blah blah blah, all this and that. Regardless of what happened, because I heard different things, but I chose to believe him, what he told me. You know, regardless of what happened, there's video evidence of him screaming at these teenagers, like trying to fight them, you know? I just roasted this guy all day, because like, I don't care what he says about me. Like, you know, it was just so funny because he's so dumb. It happened basically like overnight. I was just fighting this guy on Twitter till like 3 a.m. And then the next morning I woke up and I saw Alternative Press posted it. And we were like, oh shit.
One reply in this thread of note is Brown responding to a fan backing them up, with him attributing this incident to how sensitive liberals are, and going on a tangent about how people moving to Canada to avoid the problems in the US should be just as ready to fight as Americans when, quote, China starts paratrooping millions of poor people into the countries. There might be some context we're missing, but this seems to be a completely out of nowhere assertion to make about the incident they're talking about, and is a good example of where Brown's head is at after pledging to be more outspoken on social media.
What was funny is we were on tour at the time, and our tour route was following theirs. Like a lot of the same venues. People were like, yeah, there was 15 people here. Like, there's 20 people here.
Yeah.
We'd show up to shows, and there was like someone in the crowd. We're in the middle of a song, and he holds up a sign that just says "Trapt sucks," and I just started laughing like while I was singing because I just saw it was on a pizza box, you know.
Another tangent in this feud was from Zach Myers, the guitarist from the band Shinedown, who responded to a fan talking about the Stanhope situation with an anecdote about Trapt from when they performed with them at K-Rockathon on the 25th. He said that he confronted Brown after his performance over him previously talking badly about Brent Smith, Shinedown's lead singer, but Brown and the other Trapt bandmates ignored any attempt at discussion from any member of Shinedown. Brown initially ignored Myers' statement, though did make a post on their page talking about how Trapt was better than Shinedown before deleting it a few hours later. Eventually, after the Stanhope incident got more press coverage, Brown did respond to Myers, which turned into a multi-hour-long back and forth that mostly consisted of Brown saying he still likes Shinedown, but Zach is starting to burn the bridge. From the details given in this conversation, Brown had simply replied to a joke someone posted about Brent Smith looking like G-Eazy, and that's the only thing he did to get on Shinedown's bad side. They also go back and forth on who was ignoring who during the confrontation at Rockathon, with Brown claiming he said hello to Myers in a passive-aggressive manner and received no response, which Myers says didn't happen. Throughout these conversations, Brown makes reference to the fact that both Shinedown and Danger Kids are signed to a label, insinuating that them trying to defend themselves or resolve the conflict is a symptom of them being slaves to the music industry. He also calls Andy Bain jealous that he hasn't had a success like Headstrong yet, but also seems really fixated on resenting the fact that singles by Shinedown consistently rank high on the rock charts, attributing this to market manipulation by their label instead of the more reasonable explanation that industry backing gives them more and better promotion. After all this took place, Shinedown would be added to Brown's list of enemies, and the Stanhope incident would become another subject to push his buttons with. One last last interesting development from this is a comment someone left on an article reporting on the initial incident, claiming that friends of theirs who work at a venue in Pennsylvania witnessed the members of Trapt being disrespectful to venue staff, but then saw the band get their tour bus repossessed after their performance, in a move they referred to as ironic misfortune. This event has seemingly never been confirmed to have happened, but considering the band's financial situation given the Ormandy lawsuit and their dwindling mainstream success, it's believable enough to at least acknowledge. On August 27th, 2015, music news site Loudwire published an interview with Chris Taylor Brown, initially about the band's upcoming album, but over time turned into him acknowledging his recent controversies and elaborating on his controversial political opinions, and in which they purposefully write Brown's answers verbatim with no edits or cuts. In my opinion, this interview does a very good job at peeling back the curtain in terms of Brown's headspace, and shows a level of reflection from him that we unfortunately rarely got to see past this point. He doesn't say anything concrete in terms of politics in this interview, besides this tangent about how minimum wage jobs are meant to be a temporary stage in life and are supposed to be rough times, so increasing the minimum wage with the inflating cost of basic resources isn't a big deal. Most of it is vague statements about how America needs to stop hating each other based on who we are, and that the beauty of the country is that anyone can succeed if they put in the work. When he talks about his turbulent past year, Brown explains how emotionally taxing going through the Ormandy lawsuit was, how it essentially halted any progress on the album and made him unsure if the band would survive from the mental and financial load. He admits that doing things like ramping up on touring, releasing the acoustic album, and making the Indiegogo campaign for DNA was partially as a safety net so they could go through the lawsuit without losing all of their money. He briefly talks about how music news sites scrutinizing every move he makes on social media was also a factor in his mental state, adding that he partially regrets his actions towards Rob Scallon and his defenders. But on the other hand, he also says that people blew the Stanhope situation out of proportion, and that his responses to Bane calling him out were just jokes people took too seriously. In terms of the new album, Brown says that the themes of the tracks will be about this recent turbulent point in his life, as well as about how we generally need to be more unified, though he mostly talks in the interview vaguely about the division in American politics, and the public would be able to see how the band's creative spirit persevered through this recent rough patch when their next album, DNA, would release on August 19th, 2016. I feel like it's safe to say that at this point, the music is probably the least interesting thing about Trapt's career. None of the songs on DNA really intrigued me, both in quality or from lack thereof, and there isn't really anything I can say about these tracks that I haven't already said about previous albums. We've long since lost the possibility of stumbling across a song I think is genuinely good long ago, so we're reaching a point where a lot of the output is just them essentially going through the motions of what you would expect Trapt to sound like. But while we're on that note, I want to talk about something the band often does in the press when promoting these albums, which is their tendency to dance around what these songs are actually about, in favor of tying them to whatever's going on in their careers at that point. For example, when DNA released, Brown made a statement saying that all the times he posted intentionally controversial political opinions on Facebook was actually an attempt to connect with the band's fanbase, and that this album is really about that newfound connection they have to their fans. But in reality, besides the usual lyrical tropes of telling off unfair power dynamics or toxic personal relationships, there really isn't anything connecting Trapt's social media behavior to the themes on this album. And in the Loudwire interview, Brown says that the song Passenger was inspired by how he had to learn to get through the tough moments in life after coming out unscathed from the Ormandy lawsuit. But if that's the case, then something got lost in translation, because the song is mostly just a lot of loosely connected driving metaphors with a vague theme of putting your life in your own hands. The album was partially fan-funded, so it would be fine if they just used that to say that the album was about the fans, but trying to tie the record to the band's previous controversies is just confusing, cause nothing said or done in these songs is directly connected to them at all. They've said stuff like this other times in the past about previous albums too, and it's confusing because you can just listen to the album and realize that though their tone might be different, the things they talk about in these songs don't really change that much. So with that in mind, this album once again isn't the worst thing I've heard overall. It's become yet another example of the slow stylistic decay the band has been experiencing since their peak, and although we don't have much discography to get through past this, I'm afraid of how potentially worse this problem could become in the future, especially knowing where this band is heading. DNA also proved to be the next example of their commercial decline, as the album debuted on the album charts at number 148 before leaving the charts after a single week, and with none of its singles landing on any chart besides the track It's Over making it to the bottom of the rock airplay charts. Overall, this album once again didn't didn't make that big of a splash, but like I said, the music wasn't the aspect of the band that was garnering them attention at this time. In terms of more general happenings, the next few years were largely uneventful, besides touring and, of course, a few lineup changes. Sometime after DNA release, drummer Dylan Thomas Howard would leave the band, being replaced by Brendan Hengel, and sometime in 2017, Ty Fury left his position as lead guitarist, initially replaced by David Sodak before he left in 2018, leaving Hengel to move from drums to guitar and for Michael Smith to take the reins as drummer. But these were all events happening essentially in the background, as the main focus of many people's attention involving the band was Chris Taylor Brown's continued escapades on social media, and with these incidents now occurring after the 2016 election and inauguration of Republican President Donald Trump, the amount of intentionally controversial behavior would begin to escalate. On a regular basis, Brown would be seeking out arguments or starting petty insult matches with other users he disagreed with, and often if the conversation lasted long enough, he would eventually do something incendiary, like attempting to reignite his feud with Zach Myers of Shinedown, or calling someone a snowflake in an argument he started about the firing of FBI Director James Comey, or laughing at the idea of getting police officers to stop killing a disproportionate amount of black people. The public scrutiny against Brown's beliefs and behavior would only continue to build, but it wasn't until late 2019 and early 2020 when the band's behavior once again became the center of attention and mockery from music news publications. In September of 2019, Brown made a post angry at Minnesota Representative Ilhan Omar for a comment she made during a 20-minute speech about Muslim discrimination in America. At one point in the speech, she explained how Muslim activists and organizations understood the widespread discrimination that would follow after the September 11th terrorist attacks as they were happening, describing it as
CARE was founded after 9/11 because they recognized that some people did something and that all of us were starting to lose access to our civil liberties.
Some Republicans condemned Omar, as out of context from the rest of her speech, they thought describing 9/11 as some people did some things to be trivializing the events that took place, which was a misinterpretation of the representative's words to paint her as dismissive of the attacks in general, instead of attempting to emphasize that the whole of the group were being persecuted for the actions of a few. Brown would make a Facebook post parroting the Republican talking points and outrage surrounding this event, and although this post didn't get much initial media attention and has unfortunately gone unarchived, it's often cited as the first major incident in this new wave of controversy for the band, although the ball wouldn't truly start rolling for a few more months. On March 16th, 2020, during the beginning of the coronavirus pandemic, Brown responded to actor Chris Evans on Twitter, who criticized President Trump for walking out on a press conference about his response to the outbreak without answering any questions. He replied with an unconnected claim that Trump's decision to restrict travel to China saved a large amount of lives early into the pandemic compared to certain European countries, a claim which had been proven false well before he had posted it. On the same day, he replied to controversial religious leader and civil rights activist Talbot Swan, calling Trump a lying, degenerate racist, saying that Swan was the authority on victim mentality, to which Swan quote retweeted and called Brown racist and an untalented mayonnaise dripper. These two tweets would be the true inciting incidents, which would begin a never-ending storm of replies and tweets from Brown combating anyone who disagreed with him on these issues, or who genuinely started pushing his buttons once they realized it was easy to do so. According to reports from the time, the Trapt Twitter account sent over 900 tweets in a 48-hour period following these replies, which accounted for close to a fifth of their entire output. These exchanges were often pretty aimless, and evolved into Brown insulting people rather quickly, though a few interesting patterns did begin to emerge, like Brown saying that any white people contesting his idea that black people aren't disadvantaged in modern society because the civil rights movement already happened were simply virtue signaling in order to get more black friends, and any black people contending that racism still exists just have a chip on their shoulder and are pointing their finger at anyone but themselves, whatever that means, or reminding anyone who said that their band was irrelevant that they had over 2 million listeners on Spotify, which comparatively speaking is actually a really low number, and the performance of all their recent music would indicate otherwise. By this point, music news publications like Slate, Metal Injection, PRP, and Loudwire were taking notice of Brown's social media use, and members of other rock bands started pushing back or making fun of Brown's behavior. On March 19th, Riley Gale of the band Power Trip jokingly tweeted out a challenge to Brown to see who could sell more tickets at an event. Considering that Power Trip was a less popular band than Trapt even during this point in their careers, this challenge should have been a slam dunk for Brown to showcase his band's superior reach. But instead, Brown acted like the idea was beneath him, which led to another insult-filled back and forth, in which Gale uses a Twitter auditing website on Trapt's account, which said that over 50% of the band's following was was bots. Take that with a grain of salt, cause those sites aren't the most reliable, but since Brown previously bragged about gaining followers after starting this tweet storm, it was too funny to just gloss over. When Gale later formally restated his challenge, now saying that it would be held in Trapt's hometown of Los Gatos, and that the loser now had to give their earnings from the event to a charity of the winner's choosing, Brown once again hid from the offer, even with it stacked in their favor and presented with it all going to a good cause. Gale would later admit that he started posting at Brown simply because he was bored during quarantine, and since he felt he deserved some mockery after seeing them flaunt their band's success at random users for days on end. This was also the mindset of several other figures that partook in mocking Brown. Essentially, the entire online music community realized how easy it was to provoke a response from Brown, as all the self-reflection and willingness to admit fault in escalating situations he gained from his previous controversies had seemingly disappeared overnight. And easy to provoke was definitely a correct description, as the most entertaining series of events during this chaotic time for the band would soon occur in rapid succession, and these would test the limits of how far Brown would go to try and be respected by random people on the internet. In the midst of all of this commotion, a parody Twitter account masquerading as the band's profile, but with a lowercase l instead of a capital I, was created, and began posting tweets mocking Brown's band and his politics. It gained more popularity after a tweet they made on the 29th mocking Headstrong's simplistic riff started making the rounds on the site's music communities, and it wasn't long before the person they were satirizing took notice. In response to a seemingly innocuous post by the parody account, either due to this being when he found out it existed, or from the post's clearly slanderous contents, Brown issued explicitly a threat of legal action towards a parody Twitter account, claiming that he could sue the owner of the page for criminal impersonation. Legally speaking, while some states do have laws against online impersonation, there's no consensus on where the line between humor and manipulation lies, though parody is generally not counted as impersonation for means of harm or defraudment of others, especially a Twitter account that poses no financial risk to the band or doesn't seek to gain monetarily from its activity. And socially speaking, being this staunch against online parody is usually frowned upon on social media, and the idea of suing a random Twitter user for making fun of you is very funny. The parody account would respond with its trademark snark, but also attempted to meet Brown's demands, though still in a facetious manner. They changed their username to have two A's to make differentiating the official account more clear, while also changing their bio to an incredibly passive-aggressive disclaimer that this is in fact a parody. After Loudwire published an article about Brown's legal threat, he would clarify that since the account made these changes, he has no desire to sue the owner anymore, though makes it a point to call Loudwire liberal cucks, which besides reporting on his actions, I don't understand why he felt the need to say that. All of Brown's actions in these controversies had been entertaining to onlookers in the online rock community, but these incidents were usually self-contained within the Twitter metal sphere. With how much traction these stories were getting, however, it was inevitable that the general user base would learn and join in on the antics, and this new audience for Brown's mockery would be introduced by a newcomer that no one had expected to appear in this story. On April 13th, Cameron Loesch of the band Born of Osiris would upload a parody of Headstrong to Twitter, changing the lyrics to be more homoerotic to mock Chris Taylor Brown's tough guy persona.
Back up, I'll take you on. Headstrong, I'll suck off anyone.
It's unclear if the next event was directly caused by this video, but after its release, Brown made a series of erratic tweets towards the record label Sumerian Records, the label Born of Osiris is a member of, claiming that one of their bands threatened his life and saying multiple times that he's armed and that if any band from the label wants a fight, then, quote, blood will be spilled. These tweets would be deleted shortly after being posted, but a discussion was still birthed from it, with several people comparing the sales figures and reputation of modern Trapt to multiple Sumerian Records bands, and with Brown always pivoting the conversation to Spotify and Pandora numbers. In particular, people brought up that Body Count, the band fronted by rapper Ice-T, was previously on the label, and the conversation spun off into how well regarded Ice and his band is compared to Trapt. Brown would admit that he respects Ice as an actor, but continued to compare their band's numbers to try and insult Sumerian Records, again only using current streaming platform follower counts instead of overall cultural influence, which against a founding father of hip-hop he had no chance to win. People had tagged Ice-T and Body Count's Twitter pages throughout these threads almost sarcastically, but everyone was thrown for a loop when Ice-T would actually respond to one of Brown's posts, making a vaguely threatening quote retweet about when him and Brown hypothetically meet. When asked about it later, Ice-T said he first heard of Trapt when they had their feud with Power Trip the month prior, though didn't follow it that closely, and that his response was intended to mean that he thought Brown wouldn't say the things he was saying about Body Count on the internet to his face if the they ever crossed paths. The ensuing conversation between Brown and Ice unfortunately wasn't particularly eventful, as only Brown wanted to instigate any further confrontation, with Ice-T repeatedly showing that he doesn't know or care about who they are, and that he values being respected more than any popularity contest. After a while of Brown attempting confrontation, underground rapper and friend of Ice-T's Danny Diablo responded in aggressive defense of Ice to one of his tweets, from which another insult match would ensue between them. Perhaps unbeknownst to Brown, Danny Diablo was a beloved figure in the New York hardcore music and fighting world, so in insulting Danny, he inadvertently angered the entirety of those communities. On the 17th, upon learning of this beef, former pro fighter and martial arts facility owner Gavin Von Vleck made a post on Instagram proposing a charity boxing event between Brown and Danny, as another way given to Brown to prove he isn't just all talk on social media. Gavin had already garnered the interest of a venue, and according to an article published by Revolver magazine, both Danny Diablo and Riley Gale, surprisingly, were open to the idea, though with Gale only as a spectator. After the release of the Revolver article on the 21st, Brown made a series of tweets directed towards the people involved in the event, insisting to Danny Diablo that he wants Riley Gale on the card, and even attempting to intimidate Ice-T into joining the event, to which Ice would respond, clearly not taking anything he says seriously. Unfortunately, from what I could tell, no real event ever came from these interactions, and arguments between Brown and Ice or his friends would naturally fizzle out. In interviews after the fact, Ice-T says he thinks Brown's motivation for stirring the pot was partially to draw more eyes to the band to promote any upcoming music, a sentiment that others, including Brown himself at points, began to believe. And in between the onslaught of tweets, the Trapt account was occasionally making promotional posts for their next album, originally titled At the End of Chaos and Order, but changed in 2020 to Shadow Work, although more controversies would arise in the months leading up to its release. On April 15th, former singer of the band Volumes and controversial figure in their own right, Gus Farias, tweeted out an additional fight challenge to Chris Taylor Brown, which incited another back and forth between them. About an hour later, Brown would move their argument to DMs, and Farias would leak a few interesting snippets of this conversation. In the messages, Brown tried to claim that Farias wasn't a real gangster by calling him, quote, a rich Jew trying to act tough. These DMs would be spread around occasionally in Brown's replies, but wouldn't be reported on until he finally confirmed them to be real by restating his opinion that Jews in general shouldn't be able to perform trap music or act like gangsters. Ironically enough, this was in response to someone bringing up the DMs under a tweet by Brown saying that people shouldn't focus on ethnicity so much because we're all Americans at the end of the day. So with that context and the fact that he also says here that skin color shouldn't be used by someone as a reason to believe they're being oppressed, his message of racial harmony rings kind of hollow. And much like Danny Diablo, this interaction with Farias similarly didn't lead to any real physical altercation, and besides the screenshot of the DMs now being in circulation, this story doesn't garner much attention. In early April, a screenshot of a tweet by Brown began spreading throughout the site, claiming he announced that Headstrong would be on the soundtrack to the then newly announced remake of the first two Tony Hawk Pro Skater games. This image would later be revealed to be photoshopped, and after the soundtrack for the remake was released, it was revealed that Headstrong wasn't actually in the game, and in fact the original games predate Headstrong by 2 years, but this didn't slow down the spread of the screenshot. In response to a Trapt tweet on the 12th promoting a few singles the band released as pre-order bonuses for Shadow Work, a user shared a link to a Change.org petition made in response to the fake tweet calling for the removal of Headstrong from the soundtrack. Brown responded to this by saying that he would sue Change.org for allowing a slanderous petition to be posted to their website, and that anyone spreading the fake tweet would also be sued. Perhaps due to Brown's response, the initial petition was deleted in less than 24 hours, either by Change.org or the user who created it, and after that point Brown says there's no longer a need to sue. In the wake of this incident, multiple other petitions were created, one of which received over 15,000 signatures and was the one to garner significant press coverage. Other petitions proposed solutions like replacing Headstrong with a Power Trip track, or a song by Body Count, or Call Me Maybe by Carly Rae Jepsen. Brown later claimed that his behavior during this situation was him going along with the joke.
The Tony Hawk thing, we were never on Tony Hawk. I just played along with it, became a big thing for like a whole week, you know, like they're trying to get us off the game, but we were never on the game. You know, it's funny.
Despite him repeatedly making fun of users he thought legitimately believed Headstrong was in the game, and made no indication at the time that his responses to the petition were sarcastic, in the multiple times he reiterated his intentions to sue Change.org and anyone who spread the fake tweet. But regardless, this smaller situation was a brief, lighthearted reprieve from the more politically charged incidents Brown was becoming known for by this point, although those unfortunately wouldn't be paused for long. On May 29th, Brown made a series of tweets playing devil's advocate towards the murder of George George Floyd, which had happened a few days prior. He first said that Floyd was partially responsible for his own murder because he resisted arrest, though doesn't discount the part the police officer who asphyxiated him by kneeling on his neck for 9.5 minutes had to play in the situation. In response to someone disapproving of his claim, he inaccurately states that Floyd was being arrested on criminal charges, when in reality it was due to a now still unconfirmed suspicion of unknowingly paying for goods with a counterfeit bill, as well as that Floyd was resisting arrest to the point where multiple officers were necessary to subdue him, which was also untrue. Next, he parrots the repeatedly debunked claim that Floyd's underlying health conditions played a large role in his death, which, though these conditions increased his risk of complications involved in being asphyxiated from his neck getting kneeled on for 9.5 minutes, they were not responsible, directly or no, for the cause of his death. And in the next tweet, he directly claims that Floyd died of a heart attack, which is once again inaccurate from the information within Floyd's autopsy reports. In all of these posts and several of his replies, Brown continues to uncritically repeat early right-wing talking points surrounding Floyd's death, a pattern of behavior that's become painfully consistent from him by this point. If that's something you as a viewer find aggravating, then you can rest easy knowing that a few days later, on June 4th, Brown received an act of what some might call karma, as Chris Frosnack, frontman of the band Attila, posted a video of himself to Twitter recording a derisive voicemail to Brown's personal phone, inadvertently leaking his phone number to users of the site. Besides a few people texting him insults, however, Brown didn't receive much headache from this incident. This would be fortunate for him, as he and the band were in the midst of preparing for the event many following this saga were anticipating, and what all of Brown's recent antics were supposedly helping to drum up publicity for. In early July of 2020, Trapt would release their 7th, and as of writing this, most recent full-length studio album, Shadow Work. I'm very glad that this is the final album I had to listen to for this video, because the monotony and forgettability of the band's song is still so painful. Every song on here is just the band performing their patented Trapt formula to a T, with no interesting twists or reasons to return to the record unless your standards for musical variety are lower than average. It's still this big anthemic chorus drudging along at the same pace that repeats the name of the song a few times, with verses filled with vague allusions to confidently fighting for what you believe in or gaining the upper hand in a toxic relationship. If you liked Trapt before, then this album is definitely more of that, but not much else. Brown didn't talk about the album much to publications because after his controversies, he now holds a strong disdain for music news sites, but the little explanation he did give about the album would lead you to believe that the tracks are about introspection and learning about yourself through the cracks forming in your relationships. But while some of the tracks do have the typical vague theme of dysfunctional power dynamics, and the album occasionally becomes more melancholy and somewhat reflective, none of those ideas are explored that deeply or at all in some cases, plus those ideas aren't even new territory for the band lyric-wise. Plus, if Brown was truly dedicated and self-reflecting during the writing for this album as he claims to be, then he apparently didn't come to many realizations besides the ones he always talks about in his songs. Because spoilers, but the seemingly genuine admittance of responsibility we saw during the earlier controversies is never coming back. This has become another strange pattern of behavior, where Brown talks in interviews like the songs he writes are smarter and deeper than a couple of tangled metaphors for a messy breakup or about how you won't back down from the cause you're fighting for. Much like the other albums, there's nothing on here that I disliked on its own, but it's gotten to the point where the lack of terrible isn't filling the void in this album's sound where exceptionally good was supposed to be. When I said earlier that the music was the least interesting thing about the career of this band, I was not kidding. So despite all the lead up and boasting from Brown about how his controversies would drive more attention to this new project, this album only ended up being an anticlimactic end to the musical aspect of the story of this musical act. Speaking of attention, it might not be a surprise to learn that Shadow Work and all of its singles failed to reach any Billboard chart, but considering how much this album's release was being built up during the controversies, and how much Brown was bragging that all the publicity he was getting would only drive more people to listen to their music, even at one point claiming it would mean Shadow Work would outsell their previous, the album's success, or lack thereof, would obviously be something people following the scandals would find intriguing. So when the metal-centric analytics blog Stream and Destroy revealed in a post on July 14th that Shadow Work had only sold 600 copies in its first week according to Nielsen SoundScan data, it's safe to say figures watching the band's downward spiral felt somewhat vindicated. Brown would obviously dispute these numbers, claiming that the album instead sold 4,000 copies in its first week, which is a number that's still less than what he predicted, and one he has not provided any evidence for. A fact that complicates things is that the album was released digitally to streaming services on June 19th, meaning that the sales and streams made during the period between then and the official release were not counted within its first week. Confusing matters matters further is that, as I said, the album didn't make it onto any Billboard chart, unlike the band's previous release, DNA, which according to them sold a similar if not higher amount. There isn't any convenient way to confirm any reports on how many copies of the album were sold, especially in the scale of thousands or hundreds, so take all this with a grain of salt. But Nielsen SoundScan is generally considered to be the more reliable source in this situation than historically infamous success exaggerator Chris Taylor Brown. But regardless of what truly happened, publications and Twitter users collectively laughed at the fact that all this supposed publicity drawn by the controversies made either no impact or was severely detrimental to the band's success in reality. This ironic hit to the band's hubris wouldn't last long, however, as public humiliation and blows to the ego haven't stopped Brown from continuing to get himself into trouble historically, and it certainly didn't this time. On July 22nd, a post was made on a Facebook group meant to deride Trapt from a man named Travis Livingstone, the person responsible for the cover art for DNA and shadow work, as well as lyric videos for a handful of singles. He claimed to be preparing a small claims lawsuit against the band, since Brown was continuously dodging payments for Travis's work on one of the lyric videos, saying that the band's social media advertising team spent the $4,000 they needed to pay him, so payment needed to wait until September, because Brown had only $500 to his name. In response to this on Twitter, Brown says that he isn't paying Livingstone or releasing the lyric video he's currently working on, because the finished product doesn't meet the band's standards, and goes on to say that he's doing Travis a favor by not releasing his work because it's so bad that it would kill his professional career. This response doesn't really address the issue, unless there was a section of Livingstone's contract with Trapt that specified that the quality of the work would determine payment, but from the way the deal was talked about, it doesn't seem like that professional of a transaction. There aren't any legal records online regarding this dispute, but it's reported that the small claims suit was filed by Livingstone after his Facebook post, and more interestingly, this case did seem to catch the attention of at least one legal body. On September 7th, Travis Livingstone received a letter from Matt Pomfrey, a producer for the popular court TV show Judge Judy, saying that the show's researchers found the case interesting enough to potentially bring onto the show. Travis obviously shared this letter with the Trapt-hating Facebook group, and it got even more press than the initial post, since the idea of Brown's drama making it to nationally syndicated reality TV is very funny. Brown would eventually respond to the news on Twitter during an unrelated argument with a radio host, first just saying that the story isn't true, then saying he wouldn't go on the show by doubling down on Livingstone's work being of poor quality. As stated previously, there are no records online about Livingstone's small claims suit, so its outcome, or even if it came to fruition, is unclear. Hey, future me here, you know who would probably have the answers to those things I keep complaining I don't know about? Travis Livingstone himself. So I reached out to them about working with Trapt, and yep, there's definitely some interesting information that went unreported. According to Travis, they were mostly unaware of Brown's reputation when he started working with the band, and were really only made aware of it a few months before their own incident. They say that despite Brown claiming up and down that their work was of poor quality publicly, their behind-the-scenes relationship was relatively amicable in the time they worked together, with Brown approving every update Travis gave him on the progress of the video. It was only until Brown notified them that he'd be unable to pay them when he said he would, and Travis suggested he only get paid 50% up front and would put progress on the video on hold until he got paid the rest, that Brown turned hostile towards them and their work. And when they posted to the Facebook page, Brown switched from trying to convince them that he'll eventually pay the money to sending a long string of vitriolic texts, notably similar to the things he was saying publicly. Travis obviously cut contact with him at that point, which meant that Brown never actually had access to any part of the finished product they were working on, making the multiple times Brown gave weird deflections in order to not show people the video make a lot more sense. The small claim suit was in fact filed, but due to complications surrounding COVID, it never reached an official trial date. After that, and with the Judge Judy offer going nowhere, they felt like the public backlash to Brown's behavior would be punishment enough. Plus, other bands were now making offers to work with him purely out of spite for Trapt, so it wasn't like they came out of this empty-handed. I will say, getting a second perspective on one of Brown's interpersonal conflicts was interesting, and although we've seen the kind of person Brown is towards people he believes have spited him, we rarely saw the private side to any of Brown's feuds, so it's almost vindicating to know that he's just kinda like that, instead of it all being posturing for public approval. Well, I mean, it is all still that, but you get what I mean. One thing that may have complicated proceedings was that Trapt already had a previous engagement around the time of Travis's initial Facebook post that was also making headlines. In late July, the musical lineup was announced for the 80th annual motorcycle motorcycle rally in Sturgis, South Dakota, which included Trapt as well as other bands like Drowning Pool, Smash Mouth, and Quiet Riot. This event had been stirring some controversy after it was reported that they weren't requiring or enforcing mask mandates or social distancing guidelines, with the only exception being within the space's main amphitheater. The government of Sturgis attempted to cancel the event, but received pushback from local businesses who relied on profit from tourists, and they found that even if the rally didn't take place, motorcyclists would still flock to the town. So they instead issued travel restrictions, which unfortunately did little to stop traffic, and encouraged visitors to follow CDC guidelines, which most attending ended up ignoring. Leading up to the event, Brown had responded to reports on the venue's COVID policy by saying people are blowing the situation out of proportion, since the county the event is being held in had a low number of COVID cases at the time compared to the whole of the state, somehow oblivious to the fact that thousands of people from throughout the state, and to a lesser extent the country, congregating to a single location will lead to more opportunities for the virus to spread. Perhaps unsurprisingly, Brown's always had a rocky track record with talking about COVID, like when he claimed the virus wasn't a big deal because its mortality rate in the US was less than the flu, at a point when COVID had killed less than 2,000 people in the country, or saying in April of 2020 that we need to focus on protecting the economy more than preventing people from dying, or claiming he knew that Trump was given a classified document by China proving they lied about the country's number of COVID deaths, which I can't even debunk since there's no other instance of this claim anywhere else online. And unfortunately for Brown, he had once again missed the mark, as over 300 cases and 1 death were confirmed to be connected to the motorcycle rally by September, though experts say this may be an understatement given the quality of early case reporting. And in general, the Midwest saw an uptick in cases directly after the event, with its epicenter being in the Dakotas. And more close to home for Brown, pictures from the event would emerge of the shockingly small and unattentive crowd watching Trapt perform. Brown would respond by posting his own pictures, which only showed another angle of a slightly larger crowd, with people in the replies pointing out the gaps in the audience and several people faced away from the stage or looking at their phones. He then posted a screenshot of a video of the band playing Headstrong at the end of their set, still with a moderately small crowd, before posting the image again in an unrelated argument but cropped to leave the massive empty space in front of them just out of frame. Though more fortunately for them, Smash Mouth, who was performing on the same day as them, got a majority of the mainstream backlash to the event, after a few comments they made were interpreted to be in agreement with the crowd's anti-guideline sentiments. Overall, Trapt didn't do anything terrible besides being wildly misinformed and co-signing the event taking place, so this more turned out to be another perfect example of Brown's rampant overconfidence in his rhetoric, and of the lengths he would go to prove to random Twitter users that his band is still successful. On September 3rd, Fairbanks, Alaska announced a small musical concert called Back the Blue, meant as an effort to support the town's underfunded local police department, and Trapt was given top billing at this event. In the Facebook post the band made to promote the event, Brown wrote a long paragraph seemingly misinterpreting the phrase Back the Blue in this instance as the venue generally supporting right-wing anti-BLM sentiments, in which he calls out music news sites for calling him racist, right after uncritically repeating the debunked claims about the death of George Floyd they were calling him racist for. After Trapt's post, and less than 24 hours after the concert was announced, the venue released a statement saying that Trapt would no longer be performing at the event, as they had, quote, taken away from the intent of the establishment, and that a replacement act was hastily being looked for. One of the venue owners told the press that they were completely unaware of Trapt's controversies, and only recognized them from looking up Headstrong after they were recommended to them for the event. They also said they had no intention on making a political statement when organizing the concert, and really did only want to help garner funds to give back to their community struggling law enforcement in particular. Brown naturally made another Facebook post responding to the news, seemingly bewildered by the fact that the venue didn't know about Trapt's political opinions and wanted to avoid controversy after learning about them, while still confidently unaware that the event wasn't related to any right-wing counter-movements. Brown says in both of his posts that multiple other venues have cancelled shows due to his controversies, and considering that he's showing no sign of stopping, this is beginning to become a recurring hassle for the band. In fact, this isn't even the last event of theirs to be cancelled in September, and the next of which would unexpectedly lead to some perhaps surprising revelations. On September 27th, a venue in Dallas, Texas named The Trees announced that Trapt would be performing at their venue on November 21st. The next day, after being made aware of the lead singer's behavior by a handful of Twitter users, The Trees issued a statement saying that for reasons beyond their knowledge, Trapt's performance at the venue had been cancelled. Brown would respond to this the next morning by claiming that the people running The Trees were cowards who caved to alleged threats made to their venue's employees, with him also claiming later in the day that due to one user insulting them by mentioning Riley Gale Gale that fans of Power Trip were the ones who threatened the employees and got the show cancelled, which has similarly gone unsubstantiated. And it's important to note that Riley Gale passed away from a fentanyl overdose in August of 2020, shortly after his first altercation with Brown, so this accusation was seen in poor taste by some. This unfounded claim wasn't what caught people's attention about this response, however, as in the same post Brown stated that they intended their next show in Dallas to be dedicated to the Texas law enforcement and the Proud Boys, a far-right extremist organization with a history of political violence and white nationalism, as well as using the phrase POYB, which is a calling card often used by members of the group. This wasn't the first time Brown had been associated with the Proud Boys, as he had made tweets defending them in the past, which led one journalist to investigate any further connection between them before confirming that Chris Taylor Brown was in fact a member of the Proud Boys. To be clear, Brown's membership doesn't necessarily mean he's a full-on Nazi or white nationalist. It just means he's good at making excuses for associating with Nazis and white nationalists because they also agree with him on comparatively tame conservative ideals like free speech or being anti-BLM. To explain what I mean, earlier in the year during an argument about whether there were extremist actors in both political parties, Brown almost out of nowhere claims that the 2017 Charlottesville Unite the Right rally wasn't all white supremacists, because some people were simply there to protect freedom of speech and were heavily opposed to what the Nazis were doing there, later calling someone a tree hugger for opposing defense of the rally while in the same breath admitting to there being hundreds of white supremacists at the event. For clarification, the Unite the Right rally was the one where hundreds of self-identified neo-Nazis marched in a park with tiki torches chanting anti-Semitic slogans explicitly because the Virginia government wanted to remove Confederate statues from their parks. So boiling down anything that happened there as protecting freedom of speech would be incredibly disingenuous, and to try and soften those events because some people there didn't like Nazis, but were also at this explicit neo-Nazi rally organized and led by neo-Nazis for some reason is a ridiculously obtuse assertion. In fact, the leader of the Proud Boys, Gavin McGinnis, was invited to this rally, but refused to attend because he didn't want his group associated with neo-Nazis, though later said he didn't oppose members from attending on their own accord after succumbing to backlash. So Brown went farther in his apologetics than the leader of the political extremist group he's a member of, and as it turns out, this direct support and association with alt-right organizations would turn out to be both the final straw for Brown's public image and the end of the year-long social media tirade from which he had grown infamous. On November 19th, 2020, Brown made a Facebook and Twitter post promoting his account on Parler, a conservative-centric social media platform, which contained several Proud Boy calling cards, including POYB in the caption and a man wearing a Fred Perry jacket in the attached picture, which had become an unofficial uniform of Proud Boy members. Facebook, perhaps shockingly nowadays, had been very diligent in removing media that endorses the Proud Boys since 2018, since they considered it a violation of their hate speech policy. So when Brown's post was mass reported shortly after it being posted, it didn't take long for not just the post, but the entire Trapt Facebook page to be removed from the platform. And since Instagram is owned by Facebook, the band's profile and Brown's personal profile got banned from that platform as well. In response to their suspensions, Brown posted on Twitter confused at the fact that the post got reported, despite him not saying the words Proud Boys anywhere in it, after Facebook previously warned him to avoid doing so, almost willfully ignorant to all the obvious references to Proud Boy symbolism in the post, and also claiming that he would be attempting to sue Facebook for suspending them. In response to Newsweek asking for clarification on his grounds to sue Facebook, Brown replied with a copy-pasted quote from an article describing a lawsuit conservative content creator Candace Owens filed against USA Today and a Facebook-partnered political fact-checking site on the grounds that she was unfairly targeted and having her speech threatened by this fact-checking organization, a lawsuit which was dismissed in July of 2021 for failure to illustrate malicious intent. A lawsuit between Trapt and Facebook, much like any other suit Brown threatens to initiate, would never be filed, and he realistically didn't lose much in terms of spreading his message since he still had the band's Twitter account, though with how often he's been crossing the line recently, this too wouldn't last long. On December 4th, 2020, the music discussion program The Ill-Tempered Podcast premiered a new episode, and on the 6th, its host Cape would upload a snippet of the new episode to Twitter, where he talks about Chris Taylor Brown. Naturally, an argument between Cape and Brown would flare up after this tweet, and although there aren't any archives of this conversation, according to screenshots some had took, the discussion went on an interesting tangent. At one point, someone brought attention to a previous reply Brown made in an unrelated thread, extrapolating that a hypothetical mother sexually assaulting a 14-year-old boy was a consensual act with no details leading to that conclusion. And in response, Brown began posting in a way people interpreted to be defending female pedophiles with male victims, repeatedly joking that he'd congratulate the kid for getting statutorily raped. Brown is continuously adamant that what he was doing was simply joking about the societal double standards against the gender of pedophilia victims, including in a video he uploaded to YouTube in April of 2021, where he did his own version of Loudwire's Wikipedia Fact or Fiction series, which was clearly only made to address this controversy and their Facebook suspension.
I have not defended anybody engaged in any illegal activity, ever. Do I think there's a double standard? I do. I think there's a double standard. I think it's size, strength, has a lot to do with it. Let me say, I would never excuse the actions of a teacher preying on a student, no matter what sex it is. What I did do is make a joke in bad taste. Answering the question, well, what if it was your kid? And in the spirit of Too Hot for Teacher, I said, oh, I'd high five him.
Side note, he uses Van Halen's Hot for Teacher a lot in this argument, and I cut a whole segment out of this video about how that's just a terrible comparison, because that's not what the fucking song is about.
And it was a total joke, and it was meant to have fun with the other person, trigger him a little bit.
In certain points, it is clear that Brown was making facetious statements, especially at first, though with the sheer volume of posts he made on the subject afterwards, including ones where he attempts to make legitimate points towards his position, it's hard to excuse all of this as simply a misunderstanding. Posts on the subject would continue throughout the day and into the next, but it appears that this stance Brown had taken would be the final straw, as on December 8th, 2020, the Trapt Twitter account would be permanently suspended from the platform, though it's still not fully confirmed if the previous posts were what led to its deletion. Many publications would report on their suspension, and multiple figures involved in the story rejoiced at the fact that Chris Taylor Brown's constant storm of controversy would finally be coming to a close. For the most part, this is the point where the Trapt saga begins to lose steam, since Brown and the band had no platforms to directly interact with the general public anymore, or at least people outside of their existing fan base. People didn't have enough of an incentive to continue following the band's antics. Some interesting events would still occur past this point, including some I'm surprised haven't been covered elsewhere, but after the Twitter account was suspended, it essentially ended the band's spotlight as an infamous internet punching bag. Most of the band's later history would be Brown posting to right-leaning social media sites in the midst of working on new music. Although even in conservative safe spaces like these, he still couldn't escape getting ridiculed and coming into controversy. On December 14th, a Parler account purporting to be Trapt posted a lengthy, typo-ridden statement about how the band had parted ways with Chris Taylor Brown due to his views and behavior. A few minutes later, an account claiming to be Brown responded in outrage, later posting that they were attempting to sue the band for their decision. A handful of music news sites excitedly jumped on the opportunity to report that Brown had finally been fired by Trapt, but later the real Brown would re-emerge to ruin their fun, revealing that both accounts were in fact fake. This incident certainly was a clumsy mistake on the part of these websites, and I doubt that they would have reported on the story if the satire was more obvious. But it's also a good example to show that after the band's multiple suspensions, people outside of their small circle of loyal fans weren't paying attention to them all that closely, and that even the people on these alternative platforms Brown retweeted to weren't above messing with him. One aspect of the story turned out to not be entirely inaccurate, however, as a widely publicized lineup change would occur within the following weeks. On January 22nd, 2021, drummer Michael Smith announced on Instagram that he had parted ways with Trapt, citing the band's political turmoil through 2020 and the ensuing public outrage as major factors. He says that he respects everyone's right to hold their own political beliefs, even if he morally disagrees with them, but that his primary focus was on creating music, which he had felt the unnecessary vitriol created between Brown and the music community had distracted the band from. Brown would respond to Smith's post on the band's YouTube community tab, saying that Michael was bad-mouthing his former bandmates in order to get on the rock community's good side and guarantee a future position with another band, despite Smith's statement being wholly professional and amicable, with him saying that he appreciates the opportunities and connections his time with the band gave him. Brown also directly calls out news sites Loudwire and Metal Sucks for not asking him for his side of stories previously reported on, while saying that Smith simply wasn't a good fit for the band personality-wise, and revealing that the band already had a replacement for him several weeks before the announcement, which makes sense given how a different drummer, Adam Prentice, was credited on shadow work instead of Michael. In calling out these sites, Brown claimed claimed to be preparing to sue Loudwire and Metal Socks for certain things they alleged he had done in their articles, all while not asking for him to provide his own input in the stories. Besides the fake Parody Account story, there hasn't been anything particularly defaming about anything these sites have reported on to my knowledge, but in the end that doesn't matter since this was another legal threat from Brown that didn't go anywhere. Side note, if you're wondering why Brown responded to the announcement on YouTube, that's because Parler was taken off the app stores and subsequently shut down after the app was linked to the events of the January 6th Capitol riots, leaving YouTube, a few miscellaneous right-wing social media sites, and eventually TikTok to be where he spent most of his online activity. It seems Brown had a string of bad luck when it comes to social media, which makes it all the more shocking when the next Trapt controversy came from an interesting source. In June of 2021, according to reports, Trapt made a post on Facebook complaining that he allegedly got scammed by someone on the platform who happened to be transgender, calling them a trans man in quotations and referring to them as it. In the articles reporting on this, they claim that Trapt had regained access to their Facebook page in December, and activity had regularly resumed in June, and that after Brown received backlash for his comments, he changed their profile picture to a pride flag and made a post apologizing to the LGBTQ community, with an attached video of him in a Love Wins tank top wishing his followers a happy Pride Month. This may be confusing for some, since Brown had been talking about being banned from Facebook this entire time, and as it turns out, that's because these news sites fell for yet another parody account. Brown would make a TikTok post confirming that they were still banned from Facebook, and that he doesn't approve of the transphobic rhetoric the parody account was painting him to be in agreement towards. I know it's not easy to take Brown's word for it, but considering the account had been created a month after they were suspended, along with the fact that even Chris would agree that it's out of character for him to apologize after offending people, it's safe to say that this account was another parody. Perhaps due to the slander and censorship that's been thrown at him around this time, in between continuing to create new music, Brown was hit with an idea for a way to show the corrupt mainstream media how to properly run a free speech protecting platform. On July 5th, 2021, Chris Taylor Brown created a GoFundMe page for a video hosting app called Glasshouses, with a funding goal of $10,000. According to the page's description, the main gimmick of the app is what's referred to as stones, which a user can earn on videos they upload, which boosts their content's visibility, while also being able to throw your earned stones at other users' videos to reduce their visibility. It also says that stones can be used, quote, to get the attention of other users, which we unfortunately don't receive any more context on. The final lines of the section preach that Glasshouses wants to protect the free expression of its users by not allowing any form of biased censorship, which is confusing since the app would give you a currency that lets you reduce other users' visibility. Plus, the next line states that the app will also have a zero-tolerance policy for bullying and frivolous trolling, so the freedom of expression given in this pitch isn't as expansive as at first thought. This announcement went completely under the radar, so it's unclear how successful this campaign was, but from what's been archived, the page had only garnered just under $200 by the end of August, and sometime afterwards the page was completely removed from the site, and Brown has never spoken about Glasshouses since. I personally think that it's disappointing that this GoFundMe didn't get any media coverage, since the prospect of Brown attempting to build a video hosting platform centered around his strange interpretation of free speech is very funny, and I'm willing to bet that if people made fun of him for it, he would have tried to make it happen purely out of spite. But alas, Glasshouses failed to get off the ground, and afterwards Brown simply continued to make music while hopping onto any other right-leaning social media site he could find. On September 15th, Brown would join the social media site Gab, a platform with a similar reputation of right-wing extremism as Parler, though unlike Parler, Gab was initially incredibly supportive of Trapt, creating advertisements for them on the site and helping to promote their upcoming 20th anniversary tour. However, this amicable relationship would begin to break down as Brown slowly realized that the claim that Gab users were often bigoted white supremacists wasn't as ridiculous as he once thought. According to Brown, he was attempting to push back against the bigotry on the site by giving his usual appeal that we should forget race and all come together as Americans, which unfortunately only works on people who have basic empathy, as users then began insulting him and calling him racial slurs, since for those unaware, Brown is half Mexican. Brown then said he simply challenged these users to have this conversation with him in person, and felt as if they didn't deserve their anonymity if they were going to insult and spread lies about him, both of which led to him getting banned from the platform on October 2nd.
I said, no, everyone should be on this app if it's what you claim it is. The white nationalists over there didn't like that. I challenged them to talk in person. I also said they should no longer have anonymity They're making false accusations against me.
According to Gab's co-founder Andrew Torba, on the other hand, Brown was simply given a 24-hour suspension from posting after making dozens of threats of doxing and physical violence towards other users after being told to stop by moderators and continuing anyways. And dug up that on September 15th, Brown was sent an invoice payment for the ads Gab put on the site, which Brown allegedly never paid back. Brown would later begin preaching that Andrew Torba wants to keep his user base filled with white nationalists, while either ignoring the invoice or denying it was ever sent to him, before once again threatening legal action against Torba if he doesn't confess that the invoice wasn't real. It's difficult to see who's telling the truth in a situation like this, both because by this point music news outlets weren't paying attention to Trapt, so much of this went underreported, and that both Brown and Andrew Torba are people that often can't have their words be taken at face value. From what's left of Trapt's account on Gab, he continued to post on there until October 2nd, before leaving for other platforms, before briefly returning in January of 2022 to gloat about the lack of censorship on other sites and continue antagonizing Torba for temporarily suspending him 3 months earlier. And with that, we've officially reached the last widely reported on story involving Trapt. The outside attention towards the band had already been dying down since their suspensions, but after this point there isn't anything else that mainstream music news sites felt was worth reporting on. Once again, Brown did continue to have antics afterwards, but none of them were exceptionally impactful to the band's story thus far. There's a handful of stories I want to mention before we conclude, but these are essentially just smaller moments I wanted to highlight for people who've invested enough time in this video to care about where Trapt is nowadays. For a more general look, the band has continued to be in a rough patch number-wise, with any YouTube upload that isn't a music video struggling to pass 3,000 views and their streaming numbers doing decently well for their standards, but no real attempt being made to reach a wider audience than the one they already have. Their social media presence has naturally been middling as well. They returned to Facebook in August of 2022, though it's only used to promote new releases, and in terms of numbers is a shell of its former self. Their most popular platform in recent times has been TikTok, which they've been banned from several times for either harassment or hate speech, and which their current profile similarly has little reach. Speaking of which, Brown made a video threatening to sue TikTok and the owner of a Trapt parody account made after their first account got banned, while also claiming he's attempting to secure a trademark for the social media username Trapt Official, which to my knowledge was never approved or filed.
I have the trademark for Trapt Official coming, and I'm gonna sue TikTok and that guy for using it.
Also, apparently as I was editing this video, Trapt would return to Twitter in late September of 2023, and according to journalist David Levitt, Brown somehow immediately went back to trying to defend his half-joke stance on the double standards surrounding the gender of pedophilia victims. Levitt describes Brown's stance as endorsing pedophilia with no irony multiple times in his thread about the story, which is generally untrue if we take Brown's word for it that it's all a joke, and some of the interpretations he makes of Brown's tweets appear to genuinely be in bad faith. Plus, he also used a clearly photoshopped screenshot of a Truth Social post as evidence in the thread. This is frankly terrible journalism on Levitt's part, but Brown doubling down on his bit of ironically defending female pedophiles for some reason as soon as he gets his platform back makes it hard to feel too bad for him. All of this would lead Brown to threaten legal action against Levitt before getting permanently suspended from the platform once again a short time later. But not before Brown made over 1,000 replies in the at most 2-day period he returned to the site for. This all ironically came after Brown made multiple statements vowing to not talk about politics and to cut down on his social media use to help his band's image in preparation for the new album. So him immediately falling back to his old ways once he gets his platform back is, once again, very funny. In terms of politics, there would be occasional news of Trapt performances being cancelled due to their band's reputation, the most high profile of which being on February 27th, 2023, when the venue Locale in DeKalb, Illinois issued a statement saying their upcoming performance by Trapt would be cancelled after being made aware of the band's behavior through a community LGBTQ support Facebook page. It's unclear what exactly led the venue to cancel the show, but most people including Brown claimed that it was due to users of the Facebook group sending Locale's local government screenshots of transphobic posts from the Parody Facebook page. Somewhat unrelated, but in a video responding to the cancellation, Brown makes a claim that he would often repeat in the past, that in 2018, the United States government said that the Proud Boys were not a white supremacist, political extremist organization.
U.S. intelligence confirmed in 2018 that what they say about the group that I defended in 2020 and got kicked off Facebook for it are not Nazi, not white supremacists. That's the deal.
This claim comes from the FBI's response to an August memo publicized by the Clark County, Washington Police Department, where they inaccurately state that the FBI has officially designated the Proud Boys as an extremist group, which was picked up by news outlets after its publication in November as being the FBI's new official designation for the group. The head of the Portland, Oregon division of the FBI clarified in December that this was likely a misinterpretation of a briefing they conducted which examined the likelihood of acts of violence from certain groups of interests, including the Proud Boys, and states that the FBI rules prohibit investigations of individuals based off their association with groups alone. So no party in this situation claimed that the Proud Boys weren't an extremist group with ties to white supremacy. Other organizations worldwide have designated them as such, and in fact this local branch of the FBI had a whole briefing with the group included about how to identify the behavior of extremist groups. I bring this up mostly because, much like the other times I've refuted Brown's claims, all of this information is incredibly easy to find, which goes to show how deep into the conservative mindset of blind faith he's become by this point. And speaking of which, the most recent political action by Brown occurred in April of 2023, where after the Proud Boys admitted Donald Trump instigated the events of the Capitol riots during legal proceedings about their involvement in the insurrection, Brown proved definitively that he's now too conservative for this group by publicly disowning their decision and announcing that he's no longer a member of the Proud Boys for having, quote, too many feds, while briefly rambling about suing all the platforms that banned or were allegedly shadow banning him.
So that's what this is all about. Keeping me from fans. That's why I was kicked off Facebook, 600,000 followers. I told them the truth about this group, and I was kicked off. So that's going to be a lawsuit for sure. And I quit this group now because there's too many feds in the group. It's not real anymore.
In terms of just funny moments I want to showcase, there's this video from February, where Brown, perhaps half-jokingly, but who knows by this point, saying that the term divorced dad rock is a psyop created by the music industry to make the younger generation not respect Gen X.
Pretty funny, but did they come up with this like in a boardroom? Like the industry calls in Durst, hey, we really want to make fun of the people who are about 35, 40, so that their kids don't listen to them.
There's also this video from April where Brown records his laptop screen showing a trailer for John Wick 4 while one of his new songs plays in the background, like he's making a middle-aged AMV. And finally, in terms of music, in April of 2023, Brown revealed the name for their upcoming album, The Fall. And with that title and the very provocative stock images being used as the single art, you might think that this album would be about the band's infamous reputational downfall. But besides some themes of unwarranted persecution and everyone else being ignorant to the truth, the songs that have been released so far are still just the usual vaguely righteous cookie-cutter Trapt fare, so you can probably guess how I feel about them by this point. The band is still releasing songs despite limited attention, and they just begun their first leg of their promotional tour for the fall, so if all else fails, they're at least committed to the music no matter what takes them on. So now, after all that's said and done, and with frankly too much context, we can finally explore what factors truly led to the downfall of Trapt. Firstly, I'm not sure that Trapt as a whole is the thing we should be focusing on here, since Chris Taylor Brown was the sole party involved in tearing down the band's image. I've used Brown and Trapt interchangeably many times throughout this video, and that's really because he's the only member of the band that's made any decisions which led the group to where they are today. He's the only one who's got into any controversy, he's the one who was fully in control of the band's internet presence, and he's the only one that the internet latched onto as a piece of schadenfreude entertainment. The question of how Brown ruined Trapt is deceptively complicated, as it's very easy to boil it down to him being extremely conservative and an arrogant provocateur. But if we're being honest, those factors alone don't lead to the downfall of a career, especially in modern music and rock music. What I think is more likely is that once Trapt hooked in the conservative audience they were marketing themselves towards, they really didn't give them anything worth sticking around for. Besides hearing someone agree with what they believe, which wasn't as effective since apparently Brown was either too right-wing or not enough for a lot of people, the band didn't have a long-term strategy for maintaining this new audience besides to keep doing it until it gets old. And that's the issue that looms large over the story of Trapt, their inability to commit to ideas in the long term, and their insistence to stay as free from the influence from anyone as possible. The fact that Brown is a conservative isn't the main factor, since his staunch right-wing views are more of a byproduct of the type of person he ended up becoming. Chris Taylor Brown is an impulsive, insecure, and, pardon my phrasing, headstrong individual, who's quick to lash out at those he feels is trying to take him off the path he strongly feels he needs to be on. His ego has latched onto the expectation that having the persona of a tough-talking rule breaker who doesn't listen to anyone but himself would lead to respect and success. But when that failed after Twitter realized how easy it was to start a flame war with him, he had to go on the defense for so long that it would destroy the image he made of himself to genuinely reflect on his decisions for even a second. Once he turned to politics, things started to go downhill fast, as besides the fact that his beliefs are often laughably easy to disprove, it became clear that his priorities have moved away from what a lot of people who don't care about politics in general followed him for, which was the music. The albums made during their decline were great for people easily pleased by things they know they'll enjoy, but there wasn't any effort made to hook any audience besides the one they already had with more interesting ideas that were outside their comfort zone. They didn't even make much of an effort to court their new conservative audience, since the music had nothing to do with their politics, and Brown didn't lean into becoming a right-wing commentator enough to keep those people hooked outside of that. After Brown may have realized that the only way he could keep the lights on was to continuously pander to whatever conservative audience he had left while coasting off residuals from their lightning-in-a-bottle Headstrong, and that he can't possibly branch back out into the general apolitical public since his band's reputation had been cratered by his inability to step back and pick his battles, it was already too late. The fact that he fought everyone online who looked at him funny, made countless unnecessary enemies from being overly combative, attempted to start companies before abandoning them soon after, lost industry backing several times over increasingly higher standards of independence, made bog-standard repetitive alt-rock when given the full creative freedom he desired, through threats of lawsuits that never came to fruition anytime he felt slighted by anyone, and is for the most part in denial of how far his star has fallen, to the point where he makes excuses in order to not pay associates for marketing they were hired to do since he's ill-equipped to attempt them on his own, just goes to show that Brown is too short-sighted and emotionally driven to keep the public image of a creative project afloat when he's the only one at the helm. Trapt is apparently still able to get by with what little success they currently have, but I doubt this band will be in the news again anytime soon, since they have such a low profile right now. And if this long, tangled story has taught us anything, it's that you can't thrive in the entertainment industry solely off of strong principles and a single hit song from 2002 alone, and that you should be careful who you argue with on Twitter about race relations in America, because any of them could be your last. When I first started this project, Trapt becoming a laughingstock was always just internet legend I heard in passing through various online music communities. But as you could probably tell from the length of this video, I had no idea how many small yet surprisingly interesting incidents led to them having the reputation they do. Looking back at the beginning of this video and watching my reaction to the early work and history of this band, it's kind of funny to watch the hope that I had that this band would one day learn from their mistakes and, if nothing else, learn how to grasp the idea of making consistently interesting musical decisions slowly die down as time went on. And I'd be lying if I said that absorbing all of Chris Taylor Brown's almost 2-year-long constant stream of controversy wasn't entertaining, and the place that they are now, being infamous yet irrelevant, wasn't at least somewhat cathartic with all I've seen them do. And even looking into the more well-known stuff during the peak of their controversies, there were so many more intricacies and lesser-known but still amusing moments than I ever could have anticipated. Now, for a bigger project like this, usually I come out of it expecting to have some sort of newfound appreciation for the band and all they're able to accomplish. But with Trapt, they just stubbornly made the worst decisions over and over again, to the point where any potential that I might have seen in them from their earlier work and honestly endearing rise to initial popularity was completely squandered. And now that it's all said and done, I hope that this video will at least give some people a more thorough understanding of how Brown and the people who ridiculed him got to the positions they're in today. But with all that being said, that was my full dissection into the turbulent history of the band Trapt. I hope you enjoyed. And if you want to make it a reality paved in gold, then why don't you like this video? And if you're headstrong enough to take on anyone, then why don't you even subscribe as well? And I'll see you all in a much shorter video. I swear to God, I am never making anything this big for a long time. Jesus Christ.